so we published online our results for the first quarter of year 3, our Ready reporting yesterday, and I'm going to go through, take you through the results today, but obviously all of them are available online as ever. So to start with the headlines, performance against the targets. In terms of the volume target, 3.5% target, and we are exactly on course to meet that currently in the first quarter. Greenhouse gas savings are slightly under the target of 50% this year, and just a reminder, the targets on the carbon sustainability targets have gone up for this year, some of them quite significantly. Greenhouse gas target has gone up from 45 to 50%, and now we're slightly under that for the first time. That's one area where companies have generally performed relatively well. Where we're starting to fall significantly behind the government's target is on qualifying environmental standards. 33% currently meeting a qualifying environmental standard against an 80% target for this year. Now, that is a high and challenging target. It's gone up from 50% the previous year, so you might argue that leapt up very quickly, perhaps too quickly. Then again, we have to look at this in the context of when the targets were set and what we were looking towards at the time, mandatory sustainability criteria, and we are going to have that under the RED. So, yes, a challenging target, but one ultimately that is going to need to be met. A few more of the headlines from first quarter. 11 plus feedstocks, so that's around the same in terms of the number of feedstocks that we saw last year, certainly 30 plus countries, so even again, sort of similar number of countries, although overall we are seeing diversification. 64% is biodiesel, mostly Argentinian soy, that's very similar to last year, at least in terms of soy, but more and more bioethanol coming into the market, perhaps as biodiesel is starting to, I think that many suppliers are being ethanol in line, and once they put the infrastructure in, it's easier to supply it. So ethanol has clearly grown pretty quickly. I think it was 29% last year. So what about feedstocks? Let's look at those in a little more detail. Largely, they look fairly similar to last year. With an exception of wheat, which appeared for the first time last year and is growing. Palm, interestingly, is dropping off quite a lot. From year one, we had something like 10% of palm. It's down to 4% in year 3, so that's quite an interesting development. And the other thing that many of you closer to the market would be aware of in any case, but others not, is UCO. It has gone up quite significantly, around 3% in years 1 and 2 to 12% this past quarter. So big increases there. Which countries are the biofuels coming from? As I said, we've got 30 plus countries. There's definitely a tendency to a general diversification. We have got some new countries, so Spain is on the list. And some good news here, the UK has almost doubled in terms of its supply. So we were 10% last year, we're already 17% this year. So that's quite a significant increase, 108% in year 1. So good news on the UK front. And looking at that in a little more detail, it's a bit of a mixed bag here in terms of feedstocks meeting the environmental sustainability standards. That was down from 99% meeting environmental sustainability standards last year to just 56% reported thus far this year. Now, looking at the data a little more closely, it looks like suppliers have actually been misreporting, or we think at least that suppliers are misreporting quite a lot of that. We do spend quite a bit of time getting onto suppliers and getting them to check that the data that they've entered into ROS, and clearly we need to carry on doing that, because not all of them, we think, are reporting the right information currently. It's also the case that it takes time sometimes to pull information through the supply chain. The suppliers are able to update their information during the course of the year. So hopefully we'll see that figure improve. The other area to point out here is the 9% of fuels coming from an unknown land source, or previously unknown land source. That's obviously quite significant under the RED. To contrast it with fuels overall, that's actually quite a low figure, and I'll come on to that a little later. But clearly, again, looking at the RED, where you have to know the previous use of the land, that's 9%, that automatically wouldn't qualify for the Renewable Energy Directive. So on to previous land use in a little more detail. Generally, good news on this front. The unknown, where the proportion of previous land use that was unknown, or was reported as unknown, is down to 18% so far in this first quarter. You can see the 2 previous years, that was last year's unverified data, and the first year's unverified data, where we can see we've gone through 42% unknown previous land use in year 1, 29% unknown land use in year 2, down to 18% unknown in year 3. So clearly, suppliers are pulling this information through the supply chain. That's very good news, both from a sustainability perspective and from a meeting the RED perspective. Looking at greenhouse gas savings over time now, not such a great story here, at least in terms of improvements in performance. They're really relatively stable. Looking at the 3 years, there's obviously some slight improvement, and targets have increased over time. The RED methodology that we introduced at the beginning of this year, this reporting year, has probably had some effect on that. But when we analysed what the overall effect we thought would be in our annual report last year, there were winners and losers, and we thought it would probably balance out overall. And I think that is reflected. So palm, for example, is lost out under the RED methodology, but we're actually supplying a lot less palm. Sugar beet has lost out, but most of the sugar beet that we get in the UK comes from the British sugar plant, and that's actually got a very high level of carbon savings, and suppliers are able to report that. And I suppose the other thing to add here, we're talking about 50% voluntary targets set by the government rather than 35% minimum greenhouse gas saving threshold set under the Renewable Energy Directive. And we've looked at those numbers too. I'll come on to those a little later. So now on to the company figures. It's a feature of our quarterly reports that we report on individual company performance against the government's targets. And here again we have year 1 in the far left-hand corner, year 2 next to me, and the latest data from the first quarter, unverified data of year 3. All these numbers may change, it comes with that health warning, but you can see that a number of companies, so Listens, Topaz, Greenergy, Harvest, and Esso have all met or are all meeting the greenhouse gas target at the moment. A number of other companies are fairly close to the target, and there are a few that are some considerable way short. Typically, I haven't delved into those figures, but typically the reason that companies aren't meeting greenhouse gas targets relates to lack of data provision. They haven't pulled the information through the supply chain, and therefore they get relatively conservative default values, which we have in our system. It's not necessarily reflective of the fuels that they've actually supplied into the market. Yes, overall, we're at a 49% greenhouse gas savings compared to the 50% target.